After going through the weekly recap when it comes to Mythic Plus, it is now time to also do the same for the raid. We have gone through a week ago at this point, a bit over a week ago, through the balance tuning being landed on some of the specs, and we have observed the changes of many of these specs in Mythic Plus, which are still visible to this day, as we have seen already in Mythic Plus for specs like Ret, specs like Windwalker, Arms, Unholy, Shadow, even Frost and Feral were all buffed specs up to last week. So now it's time to also look at this from the raid perspective. As the title of the video implies, it's not that all of the buffs are made equal, because as you can very quickly see from the first glance, the first eye test of the results, most of the specs that were buffed last week did not actually get that big of an improvement this week. We can make this more relatable by only looking at the last week of damage results. So this only counts basically the buffed specs after the buffs. So you can see, some of the specs like Red, of course, being higher overall in results. But as for the other specs that were buffed, starting from Feral, who is still at the very bottom, Survival is also still at the very bottom, the DK specs are in the bottom half, together with Shadow Priest, with Windwalker being right bang in the middle, and Arms a couple of positions above. So for all of these other specs in terms of buffs received, there hasn't been a major improvement. Now it is true also that as we go by week, we could be, or we should be, we can say, we should be expecting some growth of some of these specs, in particular this one, and also this one, but also this one, and this one, and this one. Now, if you're wondering what all of these specs have in common, it's of course the fact that they can get their legendary, the legendary two-handed axe, which will give you more damage overall, and right now less than 10% of the logged players in raids, for example, have access to a legendary. So we don't even have that many results of these players with the damage increase of the legendary. You can check, for fun or for sadness, depending on where you stand in this, what would be your ideal, your theoretical, your AI-controlled character ideal DPS on your best in slot damage? Now, it's important also to point out that these simulations are of course being done with the legendary in mind. So if you scroll down to the DK's gear in this example, the DK will have access to the legendary. So all of these are sims with the two-handed legendary. And you can see that every single one of the two-handed weapon users is in the top half of results, including 1, 2, and 3 of them in the top 6, basically, of results. Now, when you move back to the actual reality of results, it's not quite high. These specs are not doing nearly as well as what the AI, as what a robot performing the rotation for you tells you should be doing. Technically speaking, Demo and Havoc and BM or even Arcane are amongst the bottom half of performers on simulations. But then you move back here and Demo is here, Arcane is here, Havoc is here. They're all at the top. Obviously, these simulations are for pure single target. So if we move back to the damage and we check the damage to bosses, so just single target damage done to the bosses, with a slight exception, of course, of Council, which has a couple of possible extra targets, but besides that, it's mostly single target. You do see some of the results changing, some of the levels of the specs like Feral and Balance. When you switch back to all damage, Feral and Balance drop far lower down than if we just looked at the primary target, the priority target damage, where the two specs go higher. Same goes for other more traditionally single target specs like Unholy. After the changes they have given to Unholy, now Unholy is in the top 5 in single target boss damage compared to the overall results where it's in the bang average of results. There is, as usual, the massive disparity when we look at the performances of the specs between the throughput, between the actual numbers shown in logs and their popularity. One of the disparities that continues all throughout, not just over a week, but overall in the past couple of weeks, the disparity remains, for example, Affliction Warlock. If we go back down to the parses, the amount of players actually in the raids, Affliction remains the bang last in position. It's a hard fight below 2k parses between Marksmanship Survival and Affliction, but right now Affliction is winning. And also Affliction happens to be about, what's this, 19 times? 19 times less played than Demonology. Yet, the results continue to show quite high, and yet in here, the damage continues to be almost identical to Demo. So Affliction is another one of these cases where their results are not particularly impressive in the majority of the bosses. They have a couple of outstanding results, in this example Tindral, but besides that, most of their other results are not nearly as impressive. So the stuff you see here when it comes to Affliction, even the stuff you see here in Throughput when it comes to Affliction, right? We can do the same trick in here. We can just look at bosses, we can look at Tindral, and here is the giga number of Affliction, which is literally doubling, almost doubling the damage of a whole bunch of specs. But then you move down to Smolderon, and Affliction is down to a more understandable level of performance. We can skip through most of the bosses, and Affliction goes down to having a more depressing result, right? So do not get baited in any way, thinking this spec is in any way, you know, S tier. This is another one of our videos where we continue our crusade about not being baited too much by the overall results and spend a bit more time figuring out why certain specs are here. For example, Demo is here because their damage is high overall. Subtlety is here because their damage is high overall. Even Havoc and Arcane are here because their damage is more or less consistent throughout multiple bosses, not just a specific boss where they are super overperforming. Affliction, though, does enter our fraud watch, like a few other specs we have checked before, like Devastation, like Elemental, like Balance. The results are slightly inflated at the moment. Talking about inflation is what we talked about when we mentioned the specs being buffed. The one with the better results overall for now has been Red Paladin. This was the findings we noticed in Mythic Plus, and it continues to also be true in the raid. With the result here, Red Paladin is the buffed spec that is currently having the better results in the raid. We're still not talking about some insane top tier results, right? As we scroll through the boss results in terms of damage, Red Paladin is doing okay, is doing in the upper half of the results most of the time for most of the bosses, right? Consistently though. For most of the bosses they are doing fine. Nothing exceptional, nothing OP, but you can see the effect and the growth of their buffs over time. So at the very least, Red is consistent with the increase in performance after the buffs. So is Arms. You know, it might feel depressing to mention Arms is doing better because when you look at the performance of Arms is rather middle of the pack, rather uninspiring, right? We start with Nullroot, Arms is quite literally towards the bottom. You move over to Igira, Arms is also towards the bottom half. Volcaros starts doing better on a pure single target fight. Council is a cleave spread fight, is doing okay. Larodar also towards the upper half, Nimue upper half, Smolderon upper half, Tindral, where there is way more AoE involved, is not doing nearly as well. These results, though, are an improvement compared to the state of Arms that they were in before. Even if you look at the popularity, Arms continues, for example, to be far less played than Fury. It's a case we have seen also with Demo and Affliction, although not nearly as bad, and of course BM, the other two Hunter specs, although not nearly as bad. At the very least, their performance is more consistent with decent results, rather than Affliction, who is like doing well in a couple of bosses and then much worse in the others. In the case of Arms, it's a more consistent, decent set of results throughout most of the bosses, even matching Fury Warrior at the moment. Now, the other question for today is, of course, the healing part of the buffs, because a couple of specs were also buffed in healing, namely Restoration Shaman was given a 5% healing increase across the board, and Holy Priest was also buffed a whole bunch to multiple healing tools, in particular for the raid. Sanctify, their AoE heal, was buffed. Now, There was a prediction I was having all the way since the start of this patch, where I was saying over time, eventually, bit by bit, Holy Priest would have passed Discipline and became one of the more popular healers. We stopped 10.2, quite literally 14 logs short of Holy Priest passing Discipline. However, this patch hits with some Holy Priest buffs, and the result is that, surprise surprise, the second most played healer is now Holy Priest, quickly trying to grab up pot number 1 above Mistweaver, and also now significantly gapping Discipline Priest as well. Everything is going according to plan. I don't even think this is due to the buffs given to Holy Priest. Holy Priest is just a more naturally played spec than Discipline at any given time, so you can expect every time a tier goes on 2, 3, 4 months, more and more Discipline Priest defaulting over to Holy, simply because there will be just less burst damage needed to heal. A combination of the bosses being nerfed and the raid getting more item level, doing more damage and becoming more tanky means the value of Discipline becomes weaker and weaker, and the consistent throughput of Holy Priest becomes more efficient. Obviously though, as I'm saying this, Holy Priest is still the least overall HPS spec in the game, compared to Discipline, which is doing just fine at the moment. Even if we check just the last week, with the buffs of Holy Priest, that doesn't actually change things. Holy Priest is still down in the dumps. Now, obviously, considering the popularity increase, Holy Priest has now been skyrocketed up into S tier healing quality for whatever reason. Of course, if you move over back to throughput, Holy Priest goes back where it belongs. The one, however, who, after the buffs, has increased their throughput significantly, now matching Discipline, is Resto Shaman, who is now actually doing competitive, even more so than before, competitive healing. Because even before, this was already quite a competitive set of healing. This is only for basically a week of 10.2.5, but if we go back to 10.2, Resto Shaman was already doing, in terms of HPS, quite high healing, whereas Holy Priest was doing the opposite. You can see, of course, the gap that over time and 3 different sets of buffs, Holy Priest eventually ends up getting quite close with the rest of the pack, but the other one of the specs being buffed, Resto Shaman, was doing quite nicely already, even without the need of buffing them in this patch. And here is the historic moment of Resto Shaman just going the tiny bit above Discipline, whereas Holy Priest doesn't really actually change much. That's the main change when it comes to healer buffs in the raid. The more visible one in terms of actual healing goes to Resto Shaman. However, the more visible one in terms of popularity goes to Holy Priest, which continues to rise in terms of play rate and of course has a much larger potential pool of players because every single Discipline Priest can theoretically become a Holy Priest from 1 week to the next. So technically this number could even be almost 40,000 if one spec started being played exclusively, whereas it's much harder, of course, for the other specs in this list to grow massively in number, as opposed to the duo Holy and Discipline for Priest. Now, there is of course a question to be asked by some players, perhaps a bit, perhaps feeling a bit mistreated by this, because okay, it is good. It is good that all of these specs are buffed, so now their performance is better. It's more in line with the average of the other DPS specs, right? The fact that Survival now is doing better, Arms, Ret, Unholy, Frost, Shadow Priest, all these specs are being buffed. However, if all of these specs are buffed and become stronger, then new specs are gonna be at the bottom. So we have new specs to now be the weakest ones. So are we going to be expecting buffs to those underperforming specs to continue the cycle? Balance is now one of the worst performers in the raid. Marksmanship continues. This was one of our biggest question marks when we went over all of these buffs. Why was marksmanship missing in terms of buffs? You also have Frost Mage, You also have Destruction Warlock. You still have the other one of the biggest question marks for the missing buffs, Elemental Shaman, also missing from buffs and still doing quite poorly in terms of results. So, while on one side it might be good that some of these specs have been buffed and their performance has increased, we now are left with a few other specs towards the bottom which, missed some of the buffs that might or should have gotten some more. That's the question we have for today when it comes to our updated Mythic raiding recap in terms of meta, balance and the popularity of the specs. Buffs had good results, decent I would say results for most of the specs receiving the buffs. However, now we are back to square one where we have new weak specs that might require some buffs to become more competitive. This is the question we are leaving each other for today on this Thursday, especially a good question for everyone actually currently playing those specs in the raid. If they feel very good at all that they have been dodged by Blizzard when it came to handing out buffs to a few of the underperforming specs and they ended up not being one of the buffed specs. For today, with this question, we are leaving each other on this boring weekday. We are starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's weird. It's one of those days where it says that outside is cold, but I actually don't feel cold, except for my feet.